The soft glow of chandeliers bathed the luxury restaurant in golden light. Waiters in crisp white shirts and black vests moved with trained precision, refilling wine glasses and placing expensive dishes before well-dressed guests. The clinking of silverware and the murmur of polite conversation filled the air. It was an evening of sophistication, where only the elite dined, where respect was expected, until it wasn't. Barron Trump, tall and composed, entered the restaurant with quiet confidence. At just 18, he carried himself with a grace that made people turn their heads. He wasn't arrogant or flashy, unlike many who walked in with bodyguards and loud demands. He simply wanted a peaceful dinner, a rare moment away from the public eye. He chose a quiet corner, dressed in an understated but elegant suit. As he sat down, he noticed a waiter eyeing him from across the room. The man, in his mid-40s, had a sharp jawline and eyes filled with something more than curiosity, resentment perhaps. Barron had seen looks like that before. He was used to the whispers, the unfair assumptions, the weight of his last name. The waiter approached, stiff and unsmiling. "What can I get you?" he asked curtly. Barron glanced at the menu, then up at the man, offering a polite smile. "I'll have the filet mignon, medium rare, with a side of—" "I'm sorry," the waiter interrupted, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Do you have enough money for that, or do you need to call your father?" A few heads turned. Silence stretched awkwardly over the table. Barron blinked, surprised but not rattled. He had never been the type to engage in conflict, and he certainly wasn't going to start now. "Yes," he replied simply, keeping his voice even. "I'll have the filet mignon, medium rare." The waiter scoffed. "Must be nice," he muttered under his breath, scribbling on his notepad with unnecessary force. Then, instead of walking away, he let out a short, bitter laugh. "You know, some of us actually have to work for a living. We don't just get handed everything on a silver platter." Barron could feel the weight of judgment pressing on him. He had heard this before. Entitlement, privilege, money. People assumed they knew his life, his struggles, his heart. They saw his name and decided everything else for him. He exhaled slowly. "I respect hard work," he said calmly. "I know nothing comes easy." The waiter scoffed again. "Yeah, right." He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving a few guests whispering, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Barron sat still, his fingers resting lightly on the table. He could have reported the man, made a scene, demanded another waiter, but he didn't. Instead, he looked around the restaurant and saw something else. The small, tired lines on the waiter's face, the tension in his shoulders. Something was wrong, and Barron wasn't going to respond with anger, because kindness had a power of its own, and he intended to use it. As Barron sat in silence, he felt the weight of the moment pressing on him. He could have ignored the insult, let it pass, and simply enjoyed his meal. After all, he had experienced worse: sneers, judgment, and unfair assumptions. But something about the waiter's bitterness didn't sit right with him. This wasn't just a man lashing out at privilege. There was something deeper, something raw beneath the hostility. The waiter returned moments later, setting down a glass of water with an unnecessary thud. A few droplets splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, but Barron didn't react. He simply looked up and met the man's eyes. "What's your name?" Barron asked, his voice steady, not demanding, just curious. The waiter looked taken aback. He hadn't expected a response, let alone one so calm. "Why do you care?" he asked, folding his arms. "Because I believe in treating people like people," Barron answered simply, "and I'd like to know the name of the person serving me." For a moment the waiter hesitated. Then, with a sharp breath, he muttered, "David?" Barron nodded. "It's nice to meet you, David." David's eyes flickered with something, hesitation, perhaps even guilt, but the hardness remained. "Enjoy your meal," he said, before turning away again. As the evening progressed, Barron noticed little things. David seemed distracted, his movements sharp and impatient, his jaw clenched as he took orders from other tables. He snapped at a younger server who accidentally bumped into him, and his shoulders sagged as he walked away. This wasn't just rudeness. It was exhaustion, frustration, something unseen weighing him down. When his meal arrived, Barron took a bite and nodded in appreciation. The steak was perfect, but that wasn't what held his attention. Instead, he glanced at David, who was wiping down an empty table with aggressive swipes. A thought struck him. Barron pulled out his phone and did something unexpected. He quietly called over the restaurant manager, not to complain, not to demand a replacement, but to ask a simple question. "David seems to be having a rough night," he said. "Is he okay?" The manager, an older gentleman with glasses perched on his nose, sighed. "David's been dealing with a lot. His wife is sick, cancer. Medical bills are piling up. He's working double shifts just to keep their home. He hasn't been himself lately." Barron's chest tightened. So that was it. The anger, the resentment. It wasn't about him. It wasn't about privilege. It was about a man drowning under life's weight, lashing out because he didn't know where else to put his pain. Barron looked down at his plate, then back at the manager. A decision formed in his mind. "Put my meal on his tab," he said quietly. The manager's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" Barron nodded. "And don't tell him, because sometimes kindness worked best when it came without expectation." As Barron finished his meal, he kept an eye on David, watching the way the man moved, rushed, tense, carrying a burden far heavier than the tray in his hands. The restaurant buzzed with conversation, guests lost in their luxurious meals and fine wines, oblivious to the quiet struggles of the people serving them. David passed by Barron's table once more, avoiding eye contact as he cleared a nearby table. He was still distant, still wrapped in his own frustrations, but Barron didn't take it personally. He understood now. This was a man who wasn't angry at him, but at life itself. A few minutes later, the manager approached David at the service station, speaking in hushed tones. Barron watched as confusion crossed David's face, his brow furrowing. He shook his head as if he'd misheard. "What do you mean my shift's covered?" David asked. "I still have 2 more hours." The manager gestured toward the kitchen, speaking quietly. David's posture stiffened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. "Who did this?" David's voice was sharp, defensive. The manager hesitated, glancing toward Barron's table. David followed his gaze, and their eyes met. Barron didn't look away. He simply nodded once, a small gesture of understanding. David walked toward him, his steps slow, measured. He stopped at the table, hands resting on his apron. "What did you do?" Barron set down his napkin. "I asked them to put my bill on your tab," he said lightly. "I also covered the rest of your shift." David stared at him, his expression unreadable. A tense silence settled between them. "Why?" David finally asked, his voice rough. Barron shrugged. "Because I can." He paused. "And because I know what it's like to carry a weight no one else sees." David's jaw clenched, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. The hardness in his eyes flickered, just for a moment, replaced by something raw and uncertain. "You don't know anything about me," he muttered. "I know enough," Barron said gently. "I know your wife is sick. I know you're exhausted. I know you're doing everything you can for your family." He tilted his head slightly. "And I know that sometimes, when the world feels like it's closing in, a little kindness can go a long way." David exhaled sharply, looking away as if trying to gather himself. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his apron. For the first time that evening, he didn't have a sarcastic remark. Instead, he let out a quiet, shaky breath. He stopped, shaking his head. "I don't deserve this." Barron smiled faintly. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But that's the thing about kindness. It's not about deserving, it's about giving." David swallowed hard, his eyes suspiciously glossy. He cleared his throat. I should go check on my wife." Barron nodded. "You should." David hesitated, then, with a reluctant exhale, extended his hand. Barron took it without hesitation, shaking firmly. "Thank you," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. And with that, he walked away, leaving Barron with nothing but an empty plate and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, for once, privilege had been used for something good. Barron watched as David disappeared through the restaurant's side entrance, his steps lighter than before. The room carried on as usual. Diners laughing over expensive wines, waiters moving in a choreographed rhythm, but something had shifted in the air. The manager returned, placing the receipt on the table. "That was a kind thing you did," he said softly. Barron glanced at the small slip of paper. His meal had been transferred to David's account, as requested, but he noticed something else. David's entire shift had been comped by the restaurant. "It wasn't much," Barron said, folding the receipt without looking at the total. "Just a small gesture." The manager smiled knowingly. Small gestures mean everything to people who feel invisible. Barron nodded, appreciating the truth in those words. He gathered his coat and left a generous tip, then made his way toward the exit. As he stepped outside, the crisp night air wrapped around him, cool and refreshing. A few feet away, David stood near the sidewalk, fumbling for his car keys. His shoulders were still tense, but the weight on them seemed a little lighter. He glanced up as Barron approached, his expression unreadable. "You really didn't have to do that," David said after a long pause. "I know," Barron replied simply. David let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I was a jerk in there. I shouldn't have treated you like that." Barron shook his head. "It's okay?" "No, it's not," David insisted. His voice was quieter now, almost hesitant. "I judged you without knowing you. I assumed you were just another rich kid who never had to struggle." He exhaled heavily. "Truth is, I was angry at life, not you." Barron studied him for a moment before speaking. "You're human. You're allowed to feel overwhelmed." David chuckled dryly. "Not a lot of people would say that, especially not someone like you." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Someone like me?" David hesitated, then sighed. "Someone with everything. Money, influence, a life most of us can't even imagine." Barron leaned against the street lamp, thoughtful. "You see the money, the name," he said. "You don't see the expectations, the pressure, the loneliness." David frowned. "Loneliness?" Barron offered a small smile. "It's hard to know who really cares about you when you grow up with a name that people recognize before they recognize you." David's expression softened. The two stood in silence for a moment, the city's distant hum filling the air between them. Finally, David spoke. "I think I get it now." Barron glanced at him. "Get what?" David let out a small laugh, shaking his head. "That kindness doesn't have to come from someone who's struggling. Sometimes it comes from someone who just understands." Barron smiled. "I like to believe that." David studied him for a second longer, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He held it out. "My wife and I run a small community kitchen on weekends," he said. "We feed people who don't have the luxury of fine dining. If you ever want to see what it's like on the other side of privilege, come by." Barron took the paper, unfolding it carefully. A simple address was scribbled on it, nothing fancy, just an invitation. He looked back at David and nodded. "I'll be there," David smirked. "We'll see." With that, he got into his car and drove off into the night, leaving Barron standing under the city lights, holding a slip of paper that felt heavier than it looked. The weekend arrived quicker than Barron expected, and with it came a quiet anticipation he hadn't felt in a long time. He had attended high-profile events, lavish galas, and political fundraisers, but this, walking into a small, humble community kitchen, felt like stepping into an entirely different world. The building was old but clean, the scent of warm bread and spices drifting through the air. Volunteers bustled around, chopping vegetables, stirring steaming pots, and stacking trays of food. The atmosphere was nothing like the stiff elegance of fine dining. This was real, raw, and filled with purpose. Barron stepped inside, feeling slightly out of place in his casual sweater and jeans. He wasn't used to people not recognizing him instantly, but here, he was just another face in the crowd. It was refreshing. "Didn't think you'd show," a familiar voice said. He turned to see David standing near a row of trays, arms crossed, but with a hint of amusement in his expression. He had a smudge of flour on his shirt and a towel slung over his shoulder. "I said I would," Barron replied. David nodded. All right then, you're here, so let's put you to work. Without another word, he handed Barron a ladle and gestured toward a massive pot of soup. Start serving. Barron stepped behind the counter, his hand slightly unsure as he filled bowls for the line of people waiting. Some were elderly, others young mothers with small children clinging to their sides. There were tired eyes, worn clothes, but every single person thanked him as he handed them their meal. As the line moved, he listened to quiet conversations. People talked about job searches, medical bills, lost homes. He had always known poverty existed. He'd seen statistics, read reports, but standing here, looking into the eyes of the people living it, was something else entirely. An older woman with silver hair stopped in front of him. You're new here, she observed, her sharp eyes scanning him. Barron smiled. First time, she chuckled. Well, aren't you a tall one? You play basketball? Barron laughed softly. A little, she winked. Good hands for serving food. Keep at it. She took her bowl and moved along, but something about her warmth lingered. The conversations continued, and for the first time in a long time, Barron wasn't the center of attention. He was just another person, doing something that mattered. David watched from the side, his arms still crossed. There was something different in his gaze now. Not resentment, not judgment, but something close to respect. When the last bowl had been served, Barron wiped his hands on a towel and looked over at David. So, how'd I do? David smirked. Not bad for a first-timer. Barron chuckled, but then his expression turned serious. This place, it's important. David nodded. Yeah, it is. Barron looked around at the volunteers, the people still lingering, finishing their meals. What do you guys need, more food, donations? David hesitated, then sighed. We need all of it, but honestly, we need people to care. Barron met his gaze. Then, I'll start there. And for the first time, David believed him. As the night wound down, Barron stayed longer than he had planned. The volunteers worked together, wiping down tables, stacking chairs, and sweeping the floors. The air was filled with tired laughter and easy conversation, the kind that only comes after a long day of work that actually means something. David watched Barron from across the room, still trying to make sense of him. The kid, no, the young man, had every reason to shake a few hands, smile for the cameras and leave, but he didn't. He stayed, he worked, and he listened. You clean floors too, or just serve soup? David teased, as Barron grabbed a mop. Barron smirked. I'll do whatever needs to be done. David let out a small chuckle, but said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Actions spoke louder than words. As the last of the volunteers packed up, David finally leaned against the counter, arms crossed, exhaustion visible in his posture. All right, Trump, he said, shaking his head. I give up. Barron raised an eyebrow. Give up what? Waiting for you to prove me right, David admitted. I thought you were just another rich kid who wanted to feel good about himself for an evening, but you actually care. Barron met his gaze. I told you. I know what it's like to be misunderstood. David exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, well, maybe I was the one who misunderstood you. Barron didn't gloat. He just smiled. It happens. David nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small crumpled envelope. He hesitated before handing it to Barron. This is a list of medical expenses, he muttered. For my wife. I wasn't going to show you. I didn't want pity. But if you're serious about helping, this is where it matters. Barron took the envelope, unfolding it carefully. The numbers were staggering. Bills upon bills, treatments, prescriptions. Costs that no middle-class family could ever afford alone. He looked back at David. You should have asked for help sooner. David scoffed. Yeah, because that's easy. Barron's grip tightened around the paper. It should be. David searched his face, then sighed. I don't want charity. It's not charity, Barron said firmly. It's humanity. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, David gave a small nod. All right. Barron smiled. All right. As they stepped outside, the cold air wrapped around them, but something else settled between them too. and understanding. See you next week? David asked. Barron slipped his hands into his pockets, grinning. Wouldn't miss it. And for the first time, privilege and struggle didn't stand on opposite sides. They stood together, proving that kindness, justice, love, and humanity weren't just words. They were actions. Kindness has the power to bridge worlds. If this story moved you, take action. Help someone in need, support a local charity, or simply choose compassion over judgment. Every small gesture makes a difference. Share this story, spread the message, and let's create a world where humanity comes first.